Brexit! Hey! No, you're not supposed to cheer. Hi, my name's Hughes. I'm one of the three blokes in a pub. We're normally one bloke short of having three blokes, and today we're actually two blokes short of having three blokes because Jason missed his connecting flight. He was coming over from Ireland, from Cork, ironically enough, in an Irish pub here in Chamonix. So what I thought I'd do tonight is have a little bit of a chat for the first sort of half hour about what we've been doing and what we've found out over the last 6 months doing what we've been doing with the Three Blokes in a Pub podcast. Then we're going to be talking to Nick, is it? Yeah? Are you going to be? He's going to be chatting with me about what it's like being in Chamonix, being a British citizen, and what the future holds. And we're going to be discussing that. And then we'll open up to any questions that you guys have. So just to introduce myself, my name is Hughes. I'm a Scouser. And in my original day job, I was a filmmaker. And in 2008, I was given the opportunity to make a show for Lonely Planet TV, in which I travelled around the world without flying to every country in the world. And it took me 4 years, did it all on a shoestring budget, but I managed to achieve it. Over 200 countries I visited. If there's one thing this world needs less of, it's probably borders, let me tell you that, and visas and red tape. But after finishing that, I applied to be on a game show in America. It was like Bear Grylls' The Island sort of thing. It's called SOS Island. And I won it. And the prize was a private island in the Caribbean. So me being me, I go and live on this little island. It's like 2-acre island off the coast of Panama for 3 years off grid, rainwater collection, solar power. And I had like a mobile phone signal, so I could get like 4G internet. So it was like a log cabin in the woods with internet. So that was great. I lived like a hermit for a few years, had a few parties, lots of couch surfers. And then the Brexit thing happened, and I had actually flown back to the UK. I don't want to say that, I flew back for the Brexit vote. I actually flew back to go to Glastonbury, but I'm going to tell everyone that I flew back to vote Remain, which I did with my mum. Anyway, so we went to Glastonbury and the results came through, and we were like, oh my word, what are we going to do? And I was saying at the time, well, don't worry, because it can be done. It can be done in a serious, civilized way, like Switzerland, like Norway, where you get to stay in single market, you get to stay in the customs union, you have different rules, regulations, you don't necessarily have any MEPs, but that's the price you pay. It's going to take a long time, though. I mean, some of the easiest trade deals in the world, take years to actually put together. The idea that we were going to get a good trade deal with the biggest, most successful trading bloc in the world, which actually at the moment holds a quarter of all the world's wealth put together, is ludicrous that this could be wrapped up so quickly. But instead of doing this, the government they hold a general election, they activate Article 50 without getting their ducks in a row first. They do all this mad stuff. And I was over in Panama, and I'd actually written to my MP, who's a guy called Stephen Twigg, who some of the older people here might remember. In 1997, he beat Michael Portillo in that famous election for Enfield South. And there was this, kid, I think he was only in his 20s. He beat this, very famous minister, politician bloke. And that was the shock of the night in this landslide victory for Labour in 1997. And he lost his seat in 2005, and he was sort of parachuted in to Liverpool West Derby, my constituency. And I was a Labour member at the time, and I got to know Stephen, and we got on really well. And I wrote to him before the Article 50 activation vote and said, Stephen, seriously mate, if you vote with the government for this, I will stand against you in the next election, right? All bravado me, I'm like thousands of miles away on an island. Anyway, so I wake up in March to my phone just buzzing with notifications. I'm like, what's going on? It's like Theresa May's called the snap election. All my mates know that I've written this thing to my MP, and they're like, Graham, you're gonna have to come back and stand. So I'm like, oh, bloody hell. Right, so arrange things for someone to caretake the island, fly back to the UK, and I stand for Parliament. And I actually studied history and politics in school. I had no intention of becoming a history teacher or getting involved in politics, because politics is a dirty business, I tell you. It's not a profession for honest people. I know that's a really horrible thing to say, because there are some good people in politics who are trying to do the right thing, but it's so difficult. Anyway, so I run a campaign. I got more votes than Lord Buckethead, which is good. But I continued on in the UK. I didn't go back to Panama. I stayed in the UK and started going to these marches, attending these debates, sitting on panels and things about the EU. And truth be told, I didn't know that much about the EU at the start of all this. I don't think any of us did. And so that, again, it was this like sort of steep learning curve of all this new stuff that I hadn't quite realised. I just thought the EU was this thing that was just always going to be there, like a supermarket. Do you know what I mean? It was there, it was convenient, wasn't perfect, but you know, what you're going to do. And the more I researched and the more I learned and the more I spoke to people, the more I realised, you know, this is some seriously stupid stuff we're doing here. And I made a series of videos about the effects on the agricultural industry, for example, with farming, losing the common agricultural policy, losing subsidies, what that will do to cereal farmers. If we go to World Trade Organization rules for, say, lamb, the maximum tariff on lamb, which will be charged by all countries that we don't have a free trade agreement with, which will be all the countries in the world, will be 40%. And 90% of Welsh lamb goes to the EU at the moment. So that would be devastating for Welsh farmers because, newsflash, sheep exist in other countries other than Wales. There's a lot of competition out there. And what Britain is doing is, for the first time in human history, they're putting trade sanctions on themselves. Like, usually trade sanctions are reserved for naughty countries like Iran and North Korea and Russia for doing something naughty like human rights violations or invading someone else's country. Russia! But, you know, these things are there as a mechanism to say, oi, stop that, stop being naughty, get in line. Or we're going to make everyone who buys oil from Iran pay an extra 50% or 200% or whatever it is. At the moment, Britain enjoys a free trade agreement, not just with the EU 27, but with 60 other countries on various commodities and goods. It has comprehensive free trade agreements in place with Canada, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, which are, here's something for you that I've learned in the last few months. The IMF only regard 35 of the 193 members of the United Nations, only 35 of them as advanced economies. Of those 35, 27 are in Europe. Only 8 are not. And the EU has comprehensive free trade deals with 4 of them. It's got an association agreement with Israel. It's working on a trade deal with the US, which we know is going to take ages. And it's working on trade deals with New Zealand and Japan. I'll come back to that. New Zealand and Australia. I'll come back to that in a bit. So I led the People's March against Brexit back in September last year, and off the back of that, I got to get a level of sort of notoriety in the anti-Brexit campaign, which we're really fighting with one arm tied behind our back here because we're fighting something that the government wants. We're fighting something that the opposition seems to also want, or not, I don't know, can't get a straight answer from them. We're fighting not only foreign interference and also what the billionaires in the country want, we're also fighting what every racist in the country wants. And I'm not saying that everyone who voted Leave is a racist. That's obviously not true. But everyone who's a bit racist voted Leave. It's this common mantra. So we've really got our backs against the wall. There's only about a dozen of us who are these mad activists who are going around the country and going around Europe, sort of going, what the hell's going on? Can we do something about this? And I had spoken with Kieran, the white van guy, who was made famous by his intervention on LBC. He took down Rees-Mogg, who was saying, it'll be fine, we'll have these amazing trade deals and blah, blah, blah. And he said, I'm a white van driver, I do just-in-time delivery all over the EU, and this will destroy my business, because it will. And he said, we'll have technology, we'll have this border control, And the problem is with these people is they sound very authoritative. Like, no one would take Rees-Mogg seriously if he had a Brummie accent. No offence to the bums, but, you know it. But, and also there's a guy called Jason Hunter who kept posting this really good stuff, really informative stuff about trade on Twitter and on Facebook. And I suggested we all meet up in the pub and have a chat, because there was a Daily Mash article soon after the referendum which said that Britain was sick of experts, parroting this thing that I think David Davis said. Britain's sick of experts, and we only listen to the angry bloke down the pub. So we said, well, let's go to the pub and maybe people will listen to us. So we made this podcast called Three Blokes in a Pub, and the first one was amazingly successful. We had over 1 million views across YouTube and Facebook. And it really took off, and we got offers from all over the UK and also all over Europe to come and talk about the situation, because it's so complex. None of us can really get our heads around it. So in the last few months, we have been over to Geneva. We've spoken to the trade experts over there. I'm going to come back to that, because that's got to be the end point where I go, look, I've depressed you enough. Let's talk about what we're going to do about this. We also went to Gibraltar, and we spoke to representatives of the Gibraltar government, and we spoke to people who are directly affected by the Brexit result and what the future holds for Gibraltar. And it was things like we never even considered. Like they said, well, we don't know what we're going to do with our rubbish if they close the border with Spain. Because they used to have an incinerator when the border was closed up until 1985 or 1986. But since the border's been open and we've both been part of the EU, it's been fine. So, we've just moved all of our rubbish, in a rubbish collection vans into Spain, and it goes to a landfill in Spain. We've got nowhere to put it if Spain don't want it. If Spain says, oh, you're not bringing it here, where does it go? We can't incinerate it. We could put it on a boat. What, do we take it to Morocco, I guess? They don't have the facilities at the port to put trash on a boat. It's all this kind of logistical nightmare that's been sort of set in motion that I wouldn't have thought of. Then we went to Belfast. We spoke to one of the guys who was one of the writers of the Good Friday Agreement. And he said to us, he's now a professor in the university over there, and he said, when we wrote the Good Friday Agreement, it was a really careful balancing act. And don't forget, the Good Friday Agreement is the most important post-war treaty in British and Irish history. It really is. It secured a peace in an area that hadn't known peace for decades. And he said, when we wrote it, we never thought for a second that Britain would vote to leave the EU. It was just assumed that Britain and Ireland would always be part of the EU. They'd always have a common travel area. They'd always have the same standards on goods and packaging and all that kind of stuff, and would never, ever have to have a hard border. Because the genius of the Good Friday Agreement is, if you're Northern Irish and you want to be seen as British, you can have a British passport and say to everyone that you're British. If you want to, and then travel all around Britain as much as you like, without having to ask anyone's permission. If you want to be seen as Irish and you're Northern Irish, you can have an Irish passport and you can travel all around the island of Ireland without having to ask anyone's permission. And then we went down to Dublin and we spoke to some people who worked in the government in Dublin and said, okay, what's happening here? And they said it's going to be catastrophic for the economy of Ireland, because at the moment, Britain trades more with Ireland than it does with Brazil, Russia, India, and China put together. Because we've got so much stuff coming back and forth across the border, because there's no border there. So no one really thinks about it. It's like trying to calculate the trade between Liverpool and Manchester or something like that. It's just never really crossed anyone's mind to go, oh, hang on, what if there's suddenly a border here and we have to declare what we're bringing in and out? And talking to Kieran, the van driver, was really interesting, because I learned a lot from him about just-in-time delivery. We just don't have the warehouse space. And I don't know if anyone saw in the news a couple of days ago, Amazon has bought up all of the warehouse space in the UK, because we just don't have it. They don't have very much of it, because it's all just in time. So when stuff arrives at the supermarket, when stuff arrives at the car assembly plant, it's just in time. So then we went over to Malaga and we spoke to British expats living over there, or immigrants as I like to call them. They said that in the last 2 years they've just been left in absolute limbo, because there's been no agreement on what the future holds. And we're going to talk about this in a bit, but we still don't know what the future holds. The withdrawal agreement, if it gets through, just kicks that can down the road. In 2 years' time, will you be able to, all things being well, you'll still be able to live and work and build a house and retire and marry in France? But will you be able to go over the border into Italy and conduct business over there? Will you be able to buy a house in Italy without having to ask the Italian government's permission? And this taking away of a whole layer of freedom that we have enjoyed for decades now, of being able to travel freely around Europe, being able to retire freely and not have to, justify our existence, is painful, especially to someone like me who's travelled so much, to see Theresa May stand on the steps of Downing Street and say, "We've taken away your freedom of movement." And everyone's like, what? Hang on, that's awful. Why would you, what, why? And then we went to Geneva and the guy that I do the podcast with, I've got to say, after we spoke to these, we had two big meetings with these trade experts over there. And Jason came out of the second meeting in tears. And he said, he's only cried like twice in the last sort of, 20 years. Once was when his daughter was born, and the second time was in Geneva a couple of months ago. They just sat us down and went, "You guys are in so much trouble. You have no idea how much trouble you're in." Because people keep saying, "Oh, you'll just go to WTO rules and that'll be fine." But again, like I said earlier, we're putting sanctions on ourselves. So the current tariff for lamb, Welsh lamb, if you're selling it in France or Germany or Hungary or Ireland, is 0%. If we leave without a deal, or when the withdrawal agreement ends and we haven't got a new trade deal in place, that goes to World Trade Organization maximum, which is 40%. It's particularly high on agricultural products. Britain can't feed itself. We import 50% of our food. Even when we converted our farms over the next 2 years very, very quickly, we'll still only be able to yield enough food for 75% of the population. That's over 13 million people, men, women and children, going hungry in peacetime if stuff is being held up at the border. So I'm from Liverpool, as I keep intonating with my adorable accent. We have 450 million tonnes of cargo that comes into Liverpool every year. Nearly all of that is from the EU or from countries that we currently have trading agreements with. So we don't necessarily have to check for customs. We have to check, we have to sniff for dogs and check for explosives and drugs and all that, and refugees, but we don't check everything coming in. We don't have to open every single container and look what's inside. These big ships that now come into Liverpool contain 16,000 containers. And although, we don't actually check all of them because we don't store all of them. Some of them will go back on the ship somewhere else. But we don't have the storage capacity to put those containers on the quayside for someone to open look inside, check what's inside, and then write to the people who sent it and say, "Is this what you sent us?" When we do that, we have about 3 weeks before they have to get back in touch with us to say, "Yes, this is what you sent us." So for things like fresh fruit and veg, this is disastrous because you're going to have thousands of tons of food, fresh food, which only lasts a week, sitting on the quayside rotting away. This is what happens when you put up trade barriers to trade voluntarily. So we're talking about this, and then they say, "Have you heard of the government procurement agreement?" And we went, "No." And they went, "Look it up." So we did. And you go on Bloomsburg, type it in, government procurement agreement, type in government procurement agreement Moldova. I'd never heard of this before. This is nothing to do with the EU. This is to do with the WTO. And it's an agreement between 46 countries around the world. And it means that our companies in the UK can bid on a tender for a big government job in the US, in Australia, in New Zealand, all over the EU. And they can't give preferential treatment to companies from America or from their own country, right? This market is worth $1.7 trillion. And there's 46 countries that are part of it. And we are part of it through the EU. When we leave, with a deal or without a deal, we automatically leave this government procurement agreement. And here's the problem. To get back in, we need unanimous support from the other 45 members. Moldova has said no. Tiny Moldova has said, we don't want this. Why? Because a trade delegation tried to come over last year to the UK from Moldova and we denied them visas. So they thought, "Oh, screw you then. we're gonna do our own thing. See you later. You can't join this massive market that you've enjoyed for the past few years. And then it gets worse, because not only are we putting physical barriers up to goods coming into our country, we're also putting punitive taxation on things that we make. And again, there's nothing we make in the UK that can't be made cheaper somewhere else in the world. We have this discussion when in the UK, as I said before, there's only 8 countries seen as advanced economies outside of Europe in the world. You put the GDP of every country in Africa, there's 54 countries in Africa. I should know, I've been to them all. Well, I went to 53 of them, and then South Sudan became an independent nation, and I had to go back to Africa from Australia to tick that one off the list. But there's 54 countries. You put the GDP of all them together, just add it up. That's all of the gold from South Africa, all the diamonds sold in Botswana, all of the oil from Angola in a given year. Their GDP is about half that of France's alone. One country, our closest neighbour, apart from Ireland. Then people say, oh, well, it'd be fine, we'll trade with the Commonwealth. We'll get these great deals with the Commonwealth. Great deals, Commonwealth, yeah. The Commonwealth, again, it's incredibly poor. You look at 48 of the 52 Commonwealth nations, put all their GDP together, and that includes some quite wealthy nations. Their GDP put together is less than that of the UK's, it's less than that of France's, it's less than that of Germany's. And these are single countries that are really close to us. So I keep describing it to people as this Dragon's Den pitch. I did a little skit of this where we said, I've got this great idea for my business. I'm going to tell all of my customers who are rich and live nearby to f*** off, and I'm going to trade with poor people on the other side of the world. And the dragons are just like, well, no, I'm out. It's just like, why would you even consider that to be a good idea? Sovereignty, blue passports, yeah, bendy bananas. So then we came to the sort of probably what I regard as the most devastating thing that we found out when we were in Geneva, which was that they said to us, you do realise that they're all going to sue you. And then we were like, what? Like, they're going to sue you. We're like, who? Everyone. You're pulling out of 759 separate international agreements. You have companies, the last 45 years, that have invested over £1 trillion in your economy, foreign companies, and they expect a certain amount of bang for the buck. If your Nissan Qashqais being made in Sunderland are suddenly costing the French and the Germans 20% more because they're made in Sunderland, and the market, the arse drops out of the market, then Nissan are going to want their money back. And they can do that through their government. They go up to the Japanese government, and Toyota can do this as well, and any other companies that operate in the UK, go to their government and say, we had an agreement with Britain, we invested in Britain, we gave this money to Britain, in these deprived areas to build up employment and jobs. And basically, our bottom line has been taken away for no apparently good reason. And there's 4 courts that we can be taken to. We can be taken to our own courts in the UK over this. We can be taken, if we stay in Europe, we might be able to be taken to the ECJ, but there's a court of arbitration in the WTO. There's also the World Bank, which might want to say in it. If it gets bad enough, it could be The Hague. And we're talking about thousands of companies across hundreds of countries. And even if we won every case, even if we said, no, but it was really important that we put up trade barriers because we needed our blue passports, we needed this, we needed that. He said, it doesn't matter. There's not enough lawyers in Europe to represent you. And if there was, you don't have the money to pay them to represent you. You're opening up this massive can of worms. You're doing the most complex thing that a government has ever tried to do in the history of the world, and you're doing it at the worst possible time. Because on one side of you, you've got Putin, who wants to destabilize the Western world. And on the other side, you've got Trump, who wants to destabilize the Western world. Well, he seems to. He's talking about pulling out of NATO. He's talking about pulling out of the WTO. So then when your maximum tariff of 40% on Welsh lamb, if there's no WTO, that could be 400% or 4,000%. Every country could just charge whatever it wanted for your lamb, especially if it wanted to protect its own farmers. And people say that the EU is a protectionist club. And we're like, yeah, they're protecting us. They're looking out for us. And it's not perfect. And there are things that the EU could do so much better. Refugees is a massive one. The way it dealt with things like the Eurozone problems with Greece, where it has different interest rates depending on what country you're in, but they've all got the same currency, that kind of thing just doesn't work. So it needs more work, but we're not going to change things by being outside and you know, throwing things at them going, oh, you're doing it wrong, you should do it like us. Because at the end of the day, the EU, for a lot of people in Europe, for me it represents the freedom to travel. For a lot of people in Europe, a lot of people in the UK, they seem to think of it as just a trade thing that got out of hand. But for a lot of people in Europe, for a lot of people in Germany and France and Belgium, it means peace. It's the best and most effective peace project the world has ever seen. It's taken these warring nations that have just been battering each other for the last 2,000 years, and we've got this sustained period of peace and cooperation. And we're throwing all this away. We're destabilising the whole bloc. We're destabilising Britain. And I don't know what you saw in the news today, but when you're talking about the 4% knock that the UK economy is going to take if we take May's withdrawal agreement deal, 4%. Read the small print. That's contingent on us getting a good trade deal with the US. With India. India. I once tried to get on a boat from Sri Lanka to India. This is just me, a person, right? 3 visas. It cost me over 150 quid. I had 3 separate visas just to arrive on a boat. I'm not even cargo. I was like, we're going to get... No one's got a trade deal with India. The Indian borders with Pakistan is closed. There's just one border point. It closes at 5 p.m. each day. You've got no borders with China. You've got no borders with Burma. I mean, it's India. Are you mad? And the other countries on the list are hilarious. Paraguay. Paraguay is on the list of countries we're going to get a great trade deal with for it to only be a 4% knock. And the government's own figures, which came out a while ago, said the Northeast, where I'm living at the moment, will take a 16% knock. And that's if you get these good trade deals as well, because all of these government figures are based on us getting great trade deals, which is a little bit of fantasy. And like the credit crunch was a 3% knock, and that led to 10 years of austerity. That led to the doubling of homelessness. That led to food banks going from just being a handful of food banks around the country to basically feed people who are on strike, because that was the original idea, up to the point now where there's thousands of them, and the NHS nurses are using food banks because they just don't have enough money to live, because wages haven't gone up and the economy's gone down. And like I say, when they said to us, you're doing it at the worst possible time, we are seeing the rise of this kind of populist lunatic fringe all over the world at the moment. You've seen it in the Philippines with the guy who bragged about throwing people out of helicopters. You can see it now in Brazil, where you've got a guy who's praising, you know, the tyrannical government of Brazil from the 70s and 80s. You've got Trump in America. You've got the clowns in Italy at the moment. Who I don't know what they want, but you know, they're mad as hell if they don't get it. Then we've got like Poland and Hungary, where you've got these right-wing movements stemming up. And it's all based on this sort of anger and fear of people from other places coming. And this feels like a massive, massive regression. I want to say, on my journey around the world, I went to every country. I went to North Korea. I went to Iraq. And I didn't get mugged. I didn't get beaten up. I didn't get anything stolen. I didn't get injured. I didn't even get ill. The world's not a bad place as people like to portray. But the only way that we can stop the big problems in the world that are happening at the moment, like war, like global climate change, is if we all work together. And supporting Brexit is the opposite of that. And I think a lot of people have realised this now. And I know there's going to be always those dyed-in-the-wool Brexiteers who think it's a great idea. But I think a lot of people have changed their minds over the last couple of years as things have emerged. And to say that having a people's vote would be undemocratic is kind of funny, because like people's vote is what democracy means, isn't it? Isn't that like a literal translation? Democracy, people's vote. But people know now what the deal is. And to not allow people to have their say now, do you want this deal or do you want to stay in, is an affront to democracy, as far as I'm concerned. And here's the good news. 2.5 years ago, we had this stupid referendum on a question that was ridiculously complex, but put in such a simple way. If you have a referendum in Ireland, you actually get all your terms and conditions, so you know what you're voting for, essentially. If you sign up to Tinder, you get all your terms and conditions, so you know what you're getting into. You know, we had none of that with the referendum. We were just lied to. They cheated. They lied on both sides. Leave cheated. They overspent. The money, we don't know where it came from. Russia. And also, they've been found to have criminally broken the law. This isn't just your normal politician telling a few fibs. And one of the frustrating things about the referendum is it was advisory. And the government used this to get around the fact that if it had been a compulsory, a binding referendum, if it had been a general election, if it had been a local election, it would have had to be rerun because of the electoral irregularities that went on in the polling and in the run-up, in the campaigning. But because it's advisory, they can get away with it and say, no, we don't need to do this. My perfect solution to this is next week in Parliament, 2 weeks in Parliament, they vote down the withdrawal agreement proposal by Theresa May, and they turn around and go, listen guys, this is a bad idea, we're going to not do it because we have to do things what's in the best interest of the country, and we know this isn't in the best interests of the nation, okay? So we're literally just not going to do it. And I think that's going to happen. I think maybe, if we're lucky, if Jeremy Corbyn wakes up, someone go wake him up, just get a big foghorn and just blast it by his ear. Whoa, 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 I'm awake, what do you want? A bit late. Maybe we might, yeah, I know. We're going to have this situation, we're going to have a TV debate between a Remainer who's going to pretend to want to leave and a Leaver who's going to pretend to want to remain. It's going to be really weird. But, you know, political theatre at its worst. Well, yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, we're working on that. But if we do get another vote, which I'm hoping, fingers crossed, just consider this. We got 48% of the UK population who voted to vote to remain while asleep. The campaign was awful. It had one of the most unpopular people in the country running it, which was heading it, which was David Cameron. We didn't get much support from Labour, really. Our arguments were awful. The whole, you know, the popular imagination was captured by the other side with these great slogans like "Take back control." Who doesn't want to take back control? It's great. It's meaningless, but great. And these vacuous promises of £350 million a week for the NHS. Which it wasn't just a lie that was said on a talk show. This was like put on the side of a bus. So I'm thinking if we got 48% without even trying, then this time with the 700,000 people who marched in London a couple of weeks ago, and with all of the stuff that we know now, and with these people who are very, very vocal and wanting this nightmare to end so we can just get on with our lives, I'm hoping that this time we'll win. And we need to win decisively. If we win by 52%, 53%, the arguments are still going to rage on. But if we can convince enough people, if we can talk about Brexit with people, and one of the problems that we've run into in the last couple of years about this is British people in general are very, very reluctant to talk religion and politics. So it's kind of awkward, especially when you've got a neighbour or a friend or a colleague who voted to leave, and you kind of want to bring it up, but you don't want to have an argument with them. But it's time to talk about Brexit with your friends and your family who did vote to leave, to just say, look, this is affecting my life, and tell them how it's affecting your lives, because I'm sure all of you here have been affected by it in some way because of the uncertainty. You don't know what your position's going to be in a couple of years' time, even if the withdrawal agreement goes through. If we have no deal, I don't know what the hell's going to happen. It's never happened before. We could be the first country in the world with no trade deals with anybody, because no deal doesn't mean just no deal with the EU. It means no deals. We won't have any trade deals with anyone anywhere. I want to actually wrap this up now. So I'm just going to say, yeah, there is reason to be positive about the next few months. I just want this nightmare to end and to go back to my life, please. And I want this to just end up being an advisory tale on like why you shouldn't ask an incredibly complex question and forward it in very simple terms and really not explain things to people. And one of my real bugbears about the way politicians on both sides of the House have been behaving in the last couple of years, they've been placating people rather than educating people. So we made it our mission to go out and try and find this stuff out and go, okay, well, what's it going to be like? What's the situation? What happens if we do go to WTO rules? How's that going to affect farming? How's that going to affect industry in the UK? But the guys in Geneva, on this bombshell, I'm going to leave it, they said, whatever deal you get, whether it's no deal, whether it's the withdrawal agreement, whatever, they give our entire agri-foods industry about 18 months to 2 years. And it employs 3.5 million people in the UK. Because they say every bit of food that you make in the UK, they can make it somewhere else and get it to you for cheaper.